Someone tonight has a real question about something their leadership did. Maybe it's how money moved. Maybe it's a decision that hurt someone and never got addressed. And the moment they open their mouth, touch not mine anointed, conversation over, and whatever was actually wrong never gets addressed because defending the verse became more urgent than helping the person who needed it. And you're probably already bracing for this to turn into an attack on pastors. It isn't. This is about what the words actually say. That verse gets handed out like a gag order, but open to where it actually comes from, Psalm 105, and the line right before it names exactly who it was warning. Kings, not you, not anyone with a question. Kings, being told by God to back off vulnerable people they could have crushed without consequence. By the end of this, you'll be able to read the whole passage yourself and see exactly why that's true, and why the verse, read in order, does closer to the opposite of what it's been used for. Let's do exactly that. Here's the passage in full from Psalm 105. When they were but a few men in number, yea, very few, and strangers in it, when they went from one nation to another, from one kingdom to another people, he suffered no man to do them wrong. Yea, he reproved kings for their sakes, saying, touch not mine anointed, and do my prophets no harm. 1 Chronicles 16 records almost the same words, nearly verbatim, and that chapter adds something Psalm 105 doesn't. David himself commissioned this exact song, appointing it to be sung the day the ark arrived in Jerusalem. The same man who had once refused to lift his hand against Saul in his fugitive years later placed these very words into Israel's worship as king. So before we ask what touch not mine anointed means, ask the question the verse itself answers first. Who is they? Who was few in number? Strangers, moving from nation to nation, kingdom to kingdom, with no army and no home turf to stand on? Not a congregation, not a denomination, not a paid staff with a building behind them. Look a few verses earlier in the same psalm and it names them directly. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, wandering herdsmen, moving through other people's territory, completely exposed if God didn't personally step in on their behalf. The Hebrew word for strangers here is ger, someone with no inherited land and little standing of their own in the country they were passing through. That was their actual status everywhere they went. And this is not an isolated moment for these people. Look at how Moses describes Israel, generations later, in Deuteronomy 7. The Lord did not set his love upon you, nor choose you, because ye were more in number than any people. For ye were the fewest of all people. Being few, being exposed, being in no position to defend themselves. That is not incidental to the story. Scripture keeps returning to it as the exact condition under which God chooses to act on someone's behalf. That's not a coincidence of style, it's a consistent signature. God keeps showing up on behalf of people who have no other advocate. The New Testament remembers this too. Hebrews 11 calls Abraham and the others people who confess that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Their entire lives were lived from that position. That is who this verse was written to protect. Keep that in view, because everything else in the passage builds on it. The psalm isn't making a vague claim. It's remembering specific, nameable incidents, and you can go read every one of them yourself. It helps to understand how exposed that actually made them. In the ancient Near East, a foreigner moving through someone else's territory often had little protection and no inherited claim to the land. A king had far more power in that situation than the family passing through it, which is exactly the imbalance these incidents are set inside. Genesis 12. Abraham goes down into Egypt during a famine, and out of fear for his own life, tells a half-truth about Sarai being his sister rather than his wife. Pharaoh takes her into his household, and God doesn't strike Abraham for his failure of nerve. He strikes Pharaoh's house with plagues over a wrong done to a defenseless outsider with no way to fight back. Genesis 20, the same pattern, a different king. Abimelech of Gerar takes Sarah, not knowing she is married, and God comes to him directly, not through a plague this time, but through a dream. Behold, thou art but a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. And here is the detail worth sitting with. In that very passage, Genesis 20 verse 7, God calls Abraham a prophet, not a title Abraham claimed for himself, a description God gives him, in the same breath as the warning to the king. That is the missing piece. Do my prophets no harm, in Psalm 105, is not naming a second group of protected people. It is the same wanderers described two ways: anointed and prophets, because Scripture had already called Abraham exactly that. Genesis 26 repeats the shape of the story again, a generation later, with Isaac and a king of the same city, Gerar. Same vulnerability, same divine warning. The repetition is not a coincidence. It is the entire reason a psalm written centuries later still remembers it. And it's worth noticing, the story doesn't end in permanent suspicion. And within Abraham's own lifetime, in Genesis 21, that same comes back to Abraham, not with a grievance, but to make a covenant, telling him plainly, God is with thee in all that thou doest. The warning was never meant to poison the whole relationship going forward. It was there to stop a specific kind of harm, not to make every future dealing between the powerful and the powerless adversarial. Notice, too, where God places the responsibility in each case. He doesn't require Abraham or Isaac to defend themselves or prove their worth first. He goes directly to the person with the power to cause harm and holds that person accountable. The obligation sits on the strong, not on the vulnerable. 3 times, across 2 generations, the danger runs in exactly one direction. Powerful kings, with armies and thrones, who could have destroyed a handful of traveling herdsmen and never answered for it if God had not personally intervened. That is who touch not mine anointed was warning, not a congregation questioning its own leadership. Kings, capable of real harm, aimed at people with no way to defend themselves. It is worth slowing down on the 2 actual words here, because both carry more specific meaning than the modern usage assumes. Touch in the Hebrew is naga. In this context, paired with do my prophets no harm in the very same line, it carries the sense of striking or harming, not disagreeing, questioning, or criticizing. That pairing is exactly how Hebrew poetry works. Harm, said twice, 2 different ways. Not harm, paired with disagreement. Anointed is Mashiach, set apart, consecrated, claimed for a purpose. And here's what surprises most people. That word was never reserved for someone holding a permanent office with built-in immunity. Isaiah 45:1 calls Cyrus, a pagan Persian king who never worshipped the God of Israel, his anointed, simply because God had set him apart to accomplish something specific. This wasn't a title Cyrus earned through devotion. He likely never intended to serve Israel's God at all. He had his own empire, his own gods. He was simply the person God had positioned to do one particular job, releasing the exiles and funding the rebuilding of the temple. Cyrus isn't even the only surprising use of the word. Leviticus 4:3 calls the high priest the priest that is anointed, so kings could be anointed, priests could be anointed, and a pagan foreign ruler could be anointed. All using the same Hebrew word, all describing someone set apart for a specific task, not a single untouchable class of person holding permanent immunity. Even prophet, nabi in the Hebrew, was the word God used for what Abraham was doing in that moment, not a permanent office that placed him beyond scrutiny. Abraham was never ordained into anything. He was simply, at that moment, someone God had sent, which means the protection follows the assignment, not a permanent rank. Put the 2 words back together, in their own context, and the verse says something precise. Do not harm the people I have set apart for my purposes. It does not say, do not ever raise a concern about someone in ministry. Those are 2 different sentences, and only one of them is actually in the text. Here's where it gets personal for David himself. This is the strongest real objection, and it deserves a straight answer instead of a dodge, because it is the clearest case in Scripture where the Lord's anointed names a sitting king and someone actually held the power to strike him down. David had Saul, Israel's literal anointed king, within striking distance twice, once in a cave at En-Gedi, once inside his own sleeping camp, and both times David refused to kill him. In the cave, David cuts a piece off the edge of Saul's robe instead of striking him, and even that small act troubles his conscience afterward. The Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth mine hand against him. He says it plainly to Saul himself afterward. The Lord judge between me and thee, and the Lord avenge me of thee, but mine hand shall not be upon thee. In the camp, He takes Saul's spear and water jug as proof he could have ended it right there and still does not. And to be fair to the objection, David is modeling something real and important here: restraint, respect for what God had established, a refusal to take personal vengeance into his own hands. That part of the objection is exactly right, and it matters. But look closely at what David actually refuses to do. He refuses personal vengeance. He refuses to seize the throne through violence. He does not refuse to see Saul clearly, and neither does the text. Scripture does not soften what Saul did. The jealousy, the spear thrown at his own son-in-law, the massacre of a town of priests for the crime of helping David. David spends years fleeing him. He never once pretends Saul is safe or righteous or beyond scrutiny. The Lord's anointed in David's mouth means exactly one thing: I will not raise my own hand to strike him down, and I will let God be the one who judges this. It has never meant. No one may notice what he is doing, leave his court, or tell the truth about what happened there. So what does this actually change in an ordinary moment for an ordinary person? Say someone genuinely believes money in a church has been mishandled, or someone spoke up about being mistreated, described exactly what happened to them, and got told they were attacking God's anointed for simply saying it out loud. Under the misused version of this verse, raising that gets treated as spiritual danger, as if the words themselves are aimed at the person asking and not the person they were written to protect. Read in context. The correction isn't go be loud, be accusatory, tear the person down publicly. David never did that, and nothing here licenses it. The correction is smaller and sturdier. You're allowed to see clearly, to ask honestly, to raise a concern through whatever legitimate means already exist, such as elders, a board, or an established accountability structure, and to care about people being harmed without that being framed as an assault on God himself. Concern for the vulnerable was never the crime this verse was written to punish. Harming the vulnerable was. It was never a choice between a solo crusade and total silence. It's worth saying plainly. Leaders do face real slander, real mob dynamics, and real bad faith attacks. Those are genuine dangers, and nothing here pretends otherwise. But the answer to a bad faith attack was never a verse that silences every good faith question along with it. That's a real distinction, and it's the one this verse, read in its own context, was actually built to protect. Put the whole passage back together, and it points in exactly one direction, front to back. God guarding the powerless from the powerful. Kings rebuked for the sake of wandering strangers with no army of their own. A shepherd refusing to lift a hand against a king, while still telling the truth about him to anyone who asked. The irony is worth naming plainly, once. A verse about protecting the vulnerable from powerful rulers has often been used to protect powerful leaders from vulnerable people. None of this cancels real spiritual authority or the respect owed to someone who carries it well. What it cancels is the idea that Anointed ever placed a person outside the accountability every human being stands inside. God was not protecting leaders from accountability. He was protecting his people from harm. If a phrase like this has ever been the reason someone stayed quiet, there's another verse that's been just as misread and just as often used against the very people it was written to protect. You've probably heard, "I never knew," you used to describe hell or rejection or someone who never really believed, but that phrase was never a verdict on a stranger. Watch that one next, and you'll see exactly who Jesus was actually turning away, and it isn't who you've been told.